Okay, welcome everybody. This is what we're talking about, the robotic moment, our post-discussion. I've no announcements for today. I do have a practical point for the meeting because there was a relatively small group and we had the problem last time that Claudia couldn't participate that much because she was doing the note-taking. Shall we take our own notes?
Yes, sure.
Today, okay? Then, Ali, are you still okay with being the discussion leader?
Very happy to, yeah.
Then it's all yours.
Cool. All right, shall we start with a reading round? So we say what we read and maybe give a little impression of how we found it. I did all the texts. The majority of them were Turkle texts, who I'd read before. I didn't particularly enjoy, but this time round, actually, I found them really good, and which is excellent.
Yeah, I read all the texts as well, and also particularly enjoyed Turkle. Especially because she sort of portrays it in a very sympathetic light. It was nice to see.
Yeah, I also read all the texts. Also found 2 reviews, which I also read. But I have to say, after I read Bray, I read the Turkle. I read Turkle a bit differently, or I thought a bit differently about it. But we're going to discuss that, I guess. So.
Yeah, I also read all the texts. I found them very interesting, and I also looked at one of the interviews she gave for the New York Times, I believe, and it was interesting to see how actually her way of thinking about sociable robots evolved in time, or how she went back to explain some of her insights.
Yeah, I also read all the texts. I also read the interview that Nolan did, and I must say I actually read that before I read Turkle, and that's sort of, I was annoyed by that interview, so that sort of made my state of mind when I looked at the Turkle text, so it made up my sort of thinking.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so should we hit the first learning goal? So there's a certain amount of sort of perhaps preliminary stuff that comes in the, I've forgotten which text it is, the one which is cyberculture, technology, nature, and culture.
Yeah.
So this is kind of different distinctions between different types of robot. I don't know if any of you guys picked up on that.
You mean the text with the automata and the simulacra?
Yeah, exactly.
Good suggestion.
So should we start with an automaton? Or perhaps it's better to start with tools and machines. What was this distinction that they made here between tools and machines?
Yeah, I think it hinges on the level of dependence. So tools are very dependent on an operator, whereas machines are not. And then the text moves on to say that automata, and then also like robots that we will be talking about, tend to be machines, or can only be machines. They're not tools.
Yeah, exactly. They require a sort of certain amount of autonomy.
Yeah.
So you can't just have a hand like a hammer knocking away at it. So then there's a distinction between automata and simulacra. Anyone want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, well, actually, the page numbers fell off, but at this page, it says that simulacra are devices that simulate other things, and automata are devices that move by themselves. Yeah. So that is the distinction. It's just a literal quote from the text.
Exactly. So automata don't have to look like an animal or a person. They can just be like those automated hoovers, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they move by themselves, and simulacra are more of a simulation of real life.
Exactly. So, sociable robots, how do they fit into this sort of these different definitions of robot, do you guys reckon?
I would say they tend to be more, I think you can't really draw very clear distinctions, maybe more of like a sliding scale, but I think they tend to be more like simulacra, because they have to be sociable, they have to take sort of almost human form and invite, or animal form, or and invite socialization, which I think is more difficult if you have a robot that looks like a box. So I think they tend to be simulacra.
Yeah, I think this is also substantiated in the text when Langton provides that quote of his ambitions to actually develop this type of simulacra to the level where they become models of life, so no longer something that imitates life, but something that actually shows how it could be, or a way of behaving, actually.
And also it moves beyond simulation, right? And that's what I read from this text as well. At some point, intention also becomes important, and that's also what artificial life engineers sort of want, that they also get intention and not only simulate life. So that is.
Can I ask something? Did anybody look at any of the films online?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that would help to answer this question. If you know what Cog, Kismet, Paro, etc. look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Paro best.
Yeah.
The seal.
Yeah.
The robot seal, which I thought had quite clumsy moves. Wasn't that sophisticated as I expected it to be.
As you imagined.
As I imagined, and obviously I would classify that as a simulacra because it tries to simulate a seal. Obviously. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought there was not much more to say on that video.
But they all have that in common as well, right? So they all, I mean, I've forgotten their names now, but the ones that Turkle talks about are sort of the body and the abdomen and the head of a man.
Cog and Kismet.
Yeah, Kismet, exactly. And then there was Cog, was just the face, I think. And so they all sort of relate to these sort of biological forms that we recognize.
Yeah. Nobody looked up an image of Cog and Kismet?
I remember seeing them before, but I remember it being very, very obvious that they were robots.
Yeah.
But they did have, if I remember correctly, I think they did have sort of eyes that were very, I think also like Paro's eyes, like the seal's eyes are very important. Because these eyes really are almost where most of the simulation takes place, because you can really see sort of human-like or animal-like sort of shine in these eyes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, but not like the full bodied, the image that we had in our problem text.
Yeah.
If that is simulacra, that's not how Cog and Kismet look.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so
Cool.
there are different kinds of simulacra then? The ones that are like full-bodied and
What would you say?
so we sort of should make a distinction?
There was a concept which Turkle was using at one point, which was about the sort of uncanniness. I mean, maybe this refers to the sort of the difference here. There is this kind of moment when a robot becomes so realistic that people are unsure about how to interpret it. They're not sure if it's a kind of a person or a robot, and it falls into this sort of this middle ground. So if you can definitely position it as a robot or definitely position it as a person, then it becomes much easier for people to interpret as a thing. But this might be moving on to sort of some of the later goals.
But to be honest, I found that particularly surprising because based on the text of Turkle, I would have expected them to be much more realistic in a way, much more inviting for interaction based on their looks, on their appearance as well. Whereas having looked at the images, it becomes actually obvious that what actually draws you in is the type of behaviors they can take up, the gaze, which you do not see from a picture, but probably when you're there actually invites you to approach them.
Yeah. We'll come to that, I'm sure.
For now, shall we hop on to the second learning goal? And this one was to do with the robotic moment. What is the robotic moment? Which I think is one of Turkle's ideas. Maybe to start us off, there's this sort of point that she draws in the relationship between people and robots. First of all, robots are seen as better than nothing. And so it's kind of this idea that you have maybe somebody who is older or disabled or something like that, and they can't look after themselves. They depend on the care of other people. And so if you can outsource that care to robots and sort of give that a sort of put them there, if they can't receive care from other people, then I suppose that's better than nothing, is the idea, right? And then it's better than
Then anything
Better than anything,
becomes a
right?
moment when you actually prefer the robots to human interaction, and that's something that she seems to fear quite a lot. But I would, to be honest, relate the robotic moment also to the fact that previously robots have been used in productive functions much more, in factories, for instance, or in engaging in all sorts of technological operations. Whereas nowadays, I think for Turkle, one of the problems is that actually they start to take up also caring functions, intimate functions that were previously actually fulfilled by other human beings.
yeah.
I think
That makes sense.
I think that she really stresses the part that robots are beginning to replace human companionship.
Yeah.
I think that is what the key factor that determines for her
Yeah.
a new era when it comes to robots, and she links this to vulnerability, that we are vulnerable to these new kinds of robots, that we like their companionship as it it's not so complex as a human being, and also she talks about the somewhat more social implications. It's better than nothing. There's a aging population. There are not enough people that can care for the elderly, she assumes. So we developed robots, and they're better than nothing. That was what you were hinting at.
Yeah.
I was also just thinking that maybe it's about the transformation that happens after, not only that the robot becomes better than nothing or better than anything, but also how we start looking at people then. She gives this example, but I'm not quite sure if it is in the text or if it is in the interview where I read, where she talks about someone texting on a phone while standing at a checkout. And there's then this example that actually the checkout person also becomes sort of like a robot thing, because the checkout thing, the paying, that can also be done by a robot. So why would you engage with that person? You can like look at your phone, and in the meantime your groceries are being bleeped and checked in and stuff like that. So then there's this switch where we start looking not only at robots as persons, but also that at some point persons can be seen in the same reductionist way of robots, that okay, the person here is robot as well. So I've been wondering if this also ties into that, that the robotic moment is the switch of thinking and how we engage. The things get blurred. That's my point, sort of.
Yeah.
Can I maybe also ask one question? Now you're defining the robotic moment, and rightly so, I think, from the text of Turkle, because she uses that term. But when we look at the text from the Book of Lister, what perspective do you get then on?
I actually wrote down that if you look at Lister, that this moment, I mean, from Turkle I sometimes have the idea that it's like a new thing. And if you look at Lister, this text already talks about how in the 17th century until the mid-18th century, the mechanist worldview came into being by Newton. And the idea was that there is no difference between a dog and a clock. So already their lines get blurred as well, because we start look at robots in the way how they work, and that's actually also how we started to look at people, how they work, or at biological things. So that's there is no clear distinction anymore between biology and robotics, because it's both mechanical. How does it work? So that is what I got from that, and that's also why I thought, okay, so there was already sort of a robotic moment back then. So
Yeah, there is some continuity there. What I also got from the text is that the use of robots or simulacra for entertainment purposes is also not something that is completely new to entertain people. Because although you were right to mention it was very much a matter of science, these robots try to imitate human organs to see how they work and, well, rediscover our own anatomy as part of some clockwork system that is in place. Those devices that were developed were also quite entertaining to just the mass public, and they were they were displayed at fairs and stuff. So the entertainment value to have some sort of social relationship with humans, I think that was already somewhat early in place. And I think the Jacques Drot androids are the good example that were no longer really put in place for the scientific use, but had merely a more entertainment value.
Yeah. But I also
At least
think,
that's what the text says.
yeah. But I think there's like an essential difference between, at least in my mind, between the entertainment and the sort of companionship that we're seeing now. Because in entertainment, there's a lot of distance. It's like going to a circus, or like in history where they had freak shows or something. So you were entertained, but you were entertained by this sort of complete other, like something that you didn't really identify with. So I understand that. I think especially it's interesting, sort of the scientific use of these models, than the entertainment use. But I do think like the really social idea of companionship is maybe what's new with the robotic movement.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think one of the big issues indeed, like you mentioned, is the fact that previously you would still look at them as objects. I mean, you objectify these things that you are entertained by when you go to these fairs, whereas now you actually question whether these sociable robots could be seen as subjects, as almost equal partners in a conversation, or that whether they have the potential to become such. And where do you draw the limits for that? Which was not the case indeed with
This
those
ties
automatons.
also into the uncanniness that you just mentioned, that the freak show things were sort of uncanny, and maybe the social robots are less, they are drawing us in more. I think that was actually mentioned in the
I
text.
think,
The
to be
person
honest,
who described the freak show
Yeah, but
said
the
it was...
uncanny is something that fascinates you. At the same time, you can experience revulsion, but at the same time, you can be intrigued by it. This is something that draws you in. I wouldn't say that these latest sociable robots are actually that much different, or they are not uncanny. I think, especially through that, you recognize them as robots, but then they are capable to fulfill functions that normally you would ascribe to human beings, or very intelligent creatures, and that is something that actually I think is this contrast, or this coming together of these elements, that actually intrigues you and make you play along.
I'm not saying that they are not uncanny, but I can imagine that when interacting with them, they might be less uncanny, not the freak show that you look at and you think, okay, this is really scary or strange, or that you can really interact with it. And I mean, if you look at all the examples that Turkel gives, at some point there is this, how do you say, bonding between the robot and the person. So some of the uncanniness does fall away, apparently, from her research. So even if on a ethical level, I might find it a bit uncanny, like interaction with a robot, but apparently that's not what happens in practice.
I think just to sort of put a road mark in the discussion, I think we're sort of moving away from question 2 into question 3 now, which is fine, but I think it needs to be said.
Definitely.
I was on the verge of suggesting that, but I think it's still important what we said under question 2 now. I think we had various perspectives, like the question, wait a minute, is this robotic moment new? Is it unique? We had some arguments in favor of that, but then Rieke said, I think there is still a reason to say it's a very unique moment. Robots have changed function. So that is what brings us to question 3. But you brought up the question, or maybe it was Claudia, maybe other times had their robotic moments. Let's keep this now then maybe for the more evaluative part at the end of the meeting.
So as far as this question is, how do social robots transform our interactions? That isn't this question, is it? This is the one to do with historical precedent. Is the robotic moment unique in history, is the question we're going for now.
Well, I would suggest we have partly discussed that
Okay,
now.
okay.
And that the decision about that, of course, is better than to take at the end when we've really looked at it. I thought your suggestion was good, that we are running into question 3 is the question on Turkel's arguments.
Transformation of our
Yeah, the
interactions.
transformations.
Okay.
Yeah, if we all agree?
Yeah.
I do.
Okay, then Ali.
Cool. So how do robots transform our interactions, according to Turkel? What is this transformation? there's a few narratives that she sort of strings together from her research, and I think there's a common narrative she suggests, I think, in one of the papers, which might be informative to sort of start us off. Just give me 1 second. Here we are. So she does a lot of different sort of case studies, and then she says, I can find a consistent narrative. A social robot is sent in to do a job. It could be doing crosswords or regulating food intake. So this is on page 115 of chapter 6. Just at the bottom. And once it's there, people attach. Things happen that elude measurement. You begin with an idea about curing difficulties with dieting, but then the robot and person go to a place where the robot is imagined as a cure of souls. So this is sort of the idea that she says all the different research she's done, and some of them the people embrace the robot very quickly, and some of them people sort of struggle a bit more, but ultimately embrace the robot as a sort of emotional partner. All of it leads towards the same idea. The robot comes in and the people connect to it.
It is a very big part about these sociable robots that we did not mention yet. Maybe it's good to mention that, basically she's saying that something about our human nature is at stake, namely our relationship. We interact with humans, she says, in the form of conversation. So we talk to each other, we share feelings, thoughts, emotions. But with robots, there's a different story. Robots are designed to give the illusion, she kind of implicitly hints at, of connection. So it's not a conversation, you're merely connected to the robot. And then you project your, say, human traits onto the robot. So in that sense, there is a psychology of engagement, as she tries to say it. And a robot can become a new best friend, but it is endangering our human nature, as she is trying to say, because it's not a real companionship. It's not a real conversation that is taking place between the user and the robot.
And so the difference she makes there is between people. When you interact with people, they sort of they have their own emotions and their own needs, and you have to have make room for those needs in the way that you interact with them. Whereas a robot is essentially a sort of needless thing. It just is a sort of object for you to project a sort of narcissism, I think she sees onto.
Yeah, she calls it that it becomes sort of a spare part of yourself, right? That you project your own things on it. And I also think that the idea with these robots is there is a sort of a co-shaping place of experience. So the robot learns from you, like with Cock and Kismet, they learn from you, and then there is a co-shaping of interaction. What can the robot do and what can it do? And then you sort of progress from there on. So yeah, it's a different kind of interaction than you have with an individual thinking.
But I think this is what worries her so much. The fact that actually by getting used to train these robots and becoming accustomed to the reactions you get from them, you might actually try to project them onto social interactions with other human beings and expect those other people in time to actually react in a similar way to the way in which you train your own robot. Or the fact that we'll become perhaps less responsive or differently responsive to appeals from other people to engage in particular interactions because of this particular coming together of humans and sociable robots.
I think that is also what she warns about, especially when it comes to children, right? That if you have children interact with sociable robots at some point, they might grow unrealistic expectations of what interaction in itself might mean. Because, of course, if you project your own expectations on a thing, and it always reacts in a certain way, that's not how real life happens, is sort of what she's saying.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems, at least to me, was the fact that she refers particularly to children and the elderly, which are by definition, vulnerable populations. So then it's easier to discover vulnerabilities the moment you're already looking at people who already struggle with difficulties. Children need to be socialized, they need to learn how to behave, whereas the elderly, particularly those with dementia that she refers to, or in the elderly cares, are already isolated, sick, and in need of care and attention. So I think that also.
I had the same problem.
Shall we? Just a moment. I agree. That you probably want to discuss also what hinders you about the text. But I say it's probably better done under question 4. And also, if we go into that right now, I think we're forgetting the things that Ali suggested earlier to speak about what Turkle calls this complicity. Yeah, you're partly doing that. Talk about this complicity between human beings and robots. Look closely at her arguments, and then later we come at the trouble, maybe.
I think sort of the first thing that was really important is that these people that you describe seem to be able to do this category shift all the time between how they sometimes, and there's also a discrepancy between their knowledge and their experience. So they say, oh, I know it's a robot.
Yeah.
But then I think they were describing like the great-grandmother in one of the examples, and she talks to the researchers and says, oh, I know it's a robot. But then as soon as it starts seeking attention, she turns away from them and attends to it. So I think that discrepancy was very interesting. And that also comes out in interpretations, like when the robot fails to do something, sometimes that's put down to sort of, oh, it's only a robot.
Yeah.
And at other times they really say, well, he doesn't like me, or maybe he's bored, or something like that. It was very interesting.
I thought that was particularly strong in the sort of, there's a almost auto-ethnographic section at the start of chapter 5, where she talks about meeting Cog herself for the first time, and how needy she became towards the robot very quickly. She walked in and the eyes followed her around the room, and she was sort of performing for it. She wanted its attention, and she wanted to compete against the other people for its attention. I thought that was one of the sort of...
Yeah.
And I think also important was the fact that you can actually teach them. So through the interaction, it's not just the fact that you can talk to them or, see them following through the room, but also the fact that you have that satisfaction that you taught them how to pronounce your name, or you taught them a new trick, and they can recognize particular things that they didn't before they met you. So I think that's also something that contributes to the appeal of these interactions to a large extent.
But I mean, it's also interesting that, because a lot of these robots aren't that well designed, or they're well designed obviously, but they still have a lot of limitations, and it's interesting how they sort of force you to fill in the gaps for them.
Yeah.
Like, by interacting with them, you want to believe that they are real, and so if something happens that shows this discrepancy between your experience and your knowledge, you sort of willingly fill in the gaps and say, well, rationalize it somehow.
Yeah, the example with the sign language is quite strong there, right? That at some point, I think it's with Kismet or Kok, I don't remember clearly, children are interacting with it, and then at some point there is a dysfunction in the robot, so it cannot talk back anymore, and then the children start asking themselves, oh, maybe it speaks a different language, and then when the robot still doesn't respond, they go into like sign language, and at some point, because the robot can at least make gestures, that it can copy them, and then there is again interaction established. So that is really a good example of what you are just referring to. At least that is my...
I agree. There's an endless sort of anthropomorphization, or whatever the word is, of these robotic sort of deficiencies.
There's also a somewhat implicit political argument in chapter 6. I think when she says, when she's talking about how robots are filling the gap of, say, not enough people that can care for the elderly. And then she says, it looks like technology is a cure for this gap, or this lack of professionals. And she says, but this is a social decision. We've made a social decision to use robots instead of actual trained people to help the elderly. So there's somewhat a political argument there, because she's taking it also in the societal and the broader sphere, not only talking about the direct human interaction problem, but also the social problem surrounding it. Yeah.
This idea that I think she said we are scarce, or at least we've made ourselves a scarce commodity. This kind of this feeling that we probably could be doing something about it as people rather than as by sending robotic envoys.
But the argument goes even further, which is really amazing, because it says it's not only that we're too scarce and that it's sort of, we need these robots to replace us, but there's this underlying idea that because the old are portrayed as childlike and vulnerable, and I think one of the managers of the care home says, well, this is a mistake, we shouldn't portray them as this. But we feel like, they're so vulnerable, they can't really manage human interaction. And then you move to what she really describes, where you say, okay, it's actually better than human interaction. It's not only a replacement for it, but it's better. Because with a seal, with a paro, the old person isn't really that challenged. Never really, there's no will that really contradicts theirs. Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, so we have several arguments now, we have the more political, larger scale social arguments brought up, and before that we were talking about the complicity, like how we fill in for robots, how we want to relate to robots. I think it would be good, before we move to the more evaluative questions, maybe to very shortly, if Ali agrees, go to this point of alterity. Because before, the political and social elements definitely come back when we go to more to evaluative points at the end, but let's make sure that we understand what she says about how it transforms us.
Yeah.
She speaks about alterity, for instance.
So there's a good little section in chapter 3 where she says the first thing missing from a robotic companion, I think relative to a human companion, is alterity. And that's the inability to see the world through the eyes of another. Without alterity, there can be no empathy, she says. Is that a statement you guys agree with, or have anything to add to?
Yeah, first, what does she mean with it? And then...
I think all the things I wrote down about that were evaluative.
I think in the end, the main problem is that the moment you are socialized, and I think probably that comes to the fact that she's looking at children, a big part of socialization is actually learning that there are multiple points of view in the world. So the moment you become able to see the world through other people's eyes, you become capable of empathy, and lots of your moral and also rational decisions further on will be based upon this juggling between your own point of view and the point of view of others. And her main point is the moment you're interacting with robots who would actually, or which would actually respond to your own input, so to say, where you actually project your own will, you actually miss these different points that you would actually get to interactions with other human beings, that you're no longer confronted with other points of view or with other values or preferences. And that way, you risk to become this isolated individual who self-centered, as one of the men she mentions in one of the chapters, who are only capable to deal with their own needs and worldviews.
I think that's also because you really can't. I think you can to a certain extent, but she really says you can't see the world through a robot's eyes.
Yeah, I was discussing more her arguments, whether or not we agree to it, because I think also kids, develop a lot through teddy bears, one of the examples, or animals, for instance, that are different from us. So to what extent can that actually inhibit developing empathies, I think, open for discussion.
Okay, I think we've discussed all the different learning goals now. With your permission, Nika, it'd be nice to move on to a little round of maybe concluding statements and see what we really took away from this discussion.
Good idea.
I'll start. I think what I really took away was this idea that the robotic moment might not be as radical as Turkle's making it out to look. It's got a historical precedent. We've been treating robots in similar ways, if not exactly the same way, for some time.
Yeah, what I found interesting was that there's always this sort of triangular relationship between the robot, the user of the robot, but also other people, nurses or children, who are in a relationship with this person. So I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I found interesting the methodology behind Turkle's research. As we've seen in the other texts, that Turkle isn't completely clear about her theory that connects all her findings, so to say. So I thought that is very interesting.
Yeah, I found interesting the fact that Turkle shows that the use of these robots is due to different needs that occur at the societal but also personal level, and at the same time the fact that she argues that it will impact upon different sets of values, transforming human relations from different perspectives.
Yeah. I must say, I agree with Robin. I also have problems with her methodology, or actually how she presents her methodology. Doesn't really give me a clear idea of how did she do it, and then how does she come to this conclusion. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm missing a bit.
Nice distinction too, because those again are two things. It's not just the research design, it's also how do you present your findings. Yeah. And not to forget, simple point, in the heat of the arguments, we gained some concepts. With which we can work simulacra, automata, tools, machines, authority, role of performativity, and complicity. That's stuff you can work with. But when we look back now at the task, you can see we discussed the robotic moment. You can see it's difficult. It's difficult in the arguments, the content of the arguments. Further research needs to be done, and it's difficult methodologically. And we see now where the difficulties partly are. So just to wrap the discussion up, if I would ask you now, if I would force you to write your term paper about it, what has come up now as a question for further research for you? What would you do it on? Do you want to start again?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, sure. The thing that I found interesting enough maybe to write a paper about from Turkle's argument was about the way that people use robots, or the functions that people use them for. So it's kind of like reenacting memories or just remembering in general. I thought there was maybe a difference there which would worth a little bit more research.
Yeah, I was really interested in the point that she makes about empathy and the fact that we can't have empathy with these robots.
Oh, yeah.
And I was also thinking of looking into ways in which we could perhaps have empathy with them.
Yeah, I'd like to look into some of the counter-arguments that offer a more positive outcome of the robotic moment instead of only these negative consequences that Turkle highlights.
Yeah, for me, I think it will be interesting to continue a bit her line of research actually, and to look at whether these robots truly change interactions between humans. So whether children and their parents will behave differently once the children start playing with robots, or maybe the elderly will become more responsive to people. So that is something that I would like to see.
Yeah, broaden the context.
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to see something of a comparative study, because she compares a lot of times to toys or to pets, but it would be really interesting to actually see a comparison in interaction between toys and pets, and then maybe with the same focus group with the robots. That would be see if there are really different results.
Cool.
Okay, thank you guys. I think I may take you guys up on this offer of your research papers. That's a nice study. Okay, we've done it. We've discussed the robotic moment. Thank you all, and thank you, Ali, for being the discussion leader.